Welcome back. So last time we looked at GDP when we started talking about coming out of the depression, the country wanted to um, better tools to measure, better tools to measure the health of the economy. GDP was one of those tools. Today we're going to take a dive into inflation. You're going to understand uh, what inflation is when we're done with this module and chapter. Today we'll talk about tracking inflation, how to measure changes in the cost of living. And that's essentially what inflation is. It's the cost of living, the change in the cost of living. We'll talk about how the US and other countries experience inflation, if there's any confusion over inflation, and then we'll cap it off with indexing and its limitations. The bill was worth 10 billion Zimbabwe dollars when issued in 2008. There were even bills issued with a face value of 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. The bills had 100 trillion written on them. Unfortunately, they were almost worthless. At one point, 621,984,228 Zimbabwe dollars were equal to $1. What I'll encourage you to do is when you have some time, go to YouTube and Google Zimbabwe hyperinflation, and you'll get a good idea of what a country looks like when inflation is rampant, when inflation is out of control, and the devastating effects that it could have on a country or economy. Inflation is the general ongoing rise in the level of prices in an entire economy. Inflation does not refer to the change in relative or individual prices. There is pressure for prices to rise in most markets and in most economies. And that's true. In most economies, prices will rise year over year. That's just um, economics in that context. What we don't want is we want some price stability. So we want prices to on par grow less than your wages are grow. So when you get out of college, or there's some of you that are already employed, each year you're going to go through an annual review of your performance, and your boss is going to give you an annual raise. And so if your annual raise means the adjustment to your salary is, say, 3% every year, then you don't want inflation, or you don't want the general prices rising 4% or 5% or 10%, because that means that your purchasing power, that additional 3%, has been eroded. Now it's going to take more of your money to buy staples, to buy food, energy, rent, when you see higher inflation. So we want to try to keep inflation at a targeted level. We'll talk about the Federal Reserve and the role of monetary policy. But today, the Federal Reserve's target rate for inflation is around 2%. And to me, that's a reasonable inflation rate. I would want inflation around 2% again, because your wages, when you start working, are growing at 2.5, maybe 3% per year. So the prices that you pay at HEB or your local store, you want them growing a little bit less than that. A basket of goods and services, a hypothetical group of different items with specified quantities of each one meant to represent a typical set of consumer purchases. Used to calculate the price level by looking at how prices of those items change over time, and it's computed using a weighted average. when we look at inflation, inflation is an index number, a unit-free number derived from the price level over a number of years, which makes computing inflation rates easier. Since the index has a values around 100, no dollar signs or other units are attached. And it makes it a lot easier when we are comparing inflation in other countries. Because we do the 100, we don't need any dollar signs, so we can compute and compare the inflation rate in different countries. There is a base year or arbitrary year whose value as an index number economists define as 100. Indexing allows easier eyeballing of the inflation numbers between different years. So how do we calculate it? So we take the level in the new year, level in the prior year, divided by the prior year times 100, and that gives us a percent or inflation number. How to measure changes in cost of living. The barometer we use here in the United States is what we call Consumer Price Index, or CPI. So when you're in the airport watching CNN on the television, you're normally going to hear them say CPI, or the CPI read was 2%, 2.5%. Or if it's hot, it's above the Fed target, maybe 4.5%, 5%, which is not good in my opinion. But CPI is a measure of inflation that U.S. government statisticians calculate based on the price level from a fixed basket of goods and services that represents the average consumer's purchases. Change in fixed basket, change in fixed basket of goods and services versus change in cost of living. There are some biases that are built into the CPI, substitution bias, an inflation rate calculated using a fixed basket of goods over time tends to overstate the true rise in the cost of living, because it does not take into account that the person can substitute away from goods whose prices rise considerably. And that's a great point. So you think about when you go to HEB or your grocery store and you're looking to buy ketchup. So maybe 40 years ago, the only ketchup in town was Heinz ketchup. But there's tons of brands of ketchup that you can buy. You can buy even HEB brand ketchup, and that's going to be a lot less expensive than you would if you would have bought the Heinz. So that's what we mean by substitution bias. So what about quality or new goods bias? Inflation calculated using a fixed basket of goods over time tends to overstate the true rise in the cost of living, because it does not account for improvements in the quality of goods or the invention of new goods. And that's an important point as well. The vehicle or the car built and purchased in 1970 is much different than the car built and purchased in 2026. We have many more features. Our cars can do many more things than that car could do back in 1970. And that's an example of quality or new goods bias. So CPI, a majority of CPI is made up of housing, rents. And that's a majority of income for, when you get out of school and get your first apartment, that's going to be a majority of your income from your job, is to pay for housing, food and beverages and transportation. Those are the largest components. And then you see the other components: apparel, recreation, education, other goods that make up the difference. But by far, when inflation is rising, it's going to hit you in transportation, food and beverages, and housing. So the CPI and core inflation index. The core inflation index takes the CPI and excludes volatile economic variables like energy and food prices. Economists can have a better sense of the underlying trends in prices that affect the cost of living, a preferred gauge from which to make important government policy. And so when we exclude energy and food, it kind of tamps down the calculation or the prediction of inflation and maybe gives us as economists a better, truer indication of what um, inflation is doing in the economy. But for all practical purposes, and for the purposes of this course, CPI is a good barometer. Consumer Price Index is a good barometer on year over year price changes that occur in our economy. Practical solutions for the substitution and the quality new goods bias. Again, to allow for some substitution between goods, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who produces our CPI report, uses alternative mathematical methods for calculating the CPI. They update the basket of goods behind CPI more frequently so that it can include new and improved goods more rapidly. From the substitution bias and quality new goods bias has been somewhat reduced because of those actions. The rise in CPI most likely overstates the true rise in inflation by only about 0.5% per year, which is not 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 bad or misleading. So along with CPI, which is the core of this chapter, we also have what we call Producer Price Index, PPI. You'll also hear that on the news. That is a measure of inflation based on prices paid for supplies and input by producers of goods and services. So how much does it make cost me to make a pair of Nike shoes? Or how much does it cost me to make that latte at Starbucks? Those are PPIs. So how much does it cost me to make that new Mustang or that new BMW? That's PPI. Prices of inputs that goes into constructing things, making things that we consume. International Price Index, a measure of inflation based on the prices of merchandise that are exported or imported. You won't see that a lot here in this country. The main focus is going to be on either CPI for you and I as consumers or PPI for businesses. A lot of businesses look at PPI or Producer Price Index. Employment Cost Index, a measure of inflation based on wages paid in the labor market. Again, you won't hear a lot about that either. The important point to make is if CPI is growing at 2.5%, you want your salary, your wages growing above that. If it does not, then your purchasing power is going to be less uh, the next year than it was in the current year, and that's not good. You want growing wages in an economy. You want price stability, CPI around its target range of 2%. And then finally, the GDP deflator is a measure of inflation based on the prices of all the GDP components. Remember, we talked about that in the previous chapter: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. So let's talk about how the US and other countries experience inflation. So notable waves of inflation in this country was World War One, World War Two, the 1970s. We had double-digit inflation, 17 to 20%. Again, remember, I said if you're back in 1970, your wages are going around 3%, but inflation is at 20%. Imagine the effects on consumers back then. It had detrimental effects on the economy and the economics of our country in the 1970s. What is deflation? Deflation is severe negative inflation when most prices in the economy are falling. So deflation is the opposite of inflation. That means prices are going down or are being affected negatively on an economy. A little deflation is not bad, but you do not want high deflation in an economy. Well, why not? You would ask me. Well, you've got people to employ, you've got, you know, a building that you need to pay for, you have electricity that you have to pay for, and if if there's deflation and the price you can charge for goods and services continues to go down, that's squeezing the amount of money you can make in order to run your business. Notable periods of U.S. deflation was the 2021 recession, Great Depression of the 1930s. Again, I started us off talking about how hyperinflation, an outburst of high inflation that often occurs, although not exclusively, when economies shift from a controlled economy to a market-oriented economy. The closest the United States has ever reached hyperinflation was during the 1865 Civil War, where we had to print a lot of money in order to um, to move that war along. Here's a graphical presentation of inflation rate from 1948 to 2020. You can see it oscillate. You can look at 1970 to 1980. You see how high inflation was. You see those peaks. It was not a good time. Again, you want stable inflation. You want inflation. The inflation target is around 2%. But here, the U.S. price level rose relatively little over the first half of the 20th century. Afterwards, it gradually increased until about 1973, then increases more rapidly through the remainder of the 70s and beyond, with periodic dips until 2016 when it reached 240. So we'll talk more about monetary policy, fiscal policy, and how we use those different tools to attack inflation when it's beginning to rise above trend. Again, trend. What's trend? The Federal Reserve says their target for inflation is right at around 2%. Now, this chart shows the annual percentage change in consumer prices compared with previous year's consumer prices in the US, UK, Japan, and Germany. So you see they kind of move in somewhat in lockstep with each other. And that's very interesting. You've seen the peaks in the 1970s, but as of late, we've been, since 2020, uh, in 2020, we were at or below target in inflation. Again, countries with relatively high inflation rates, you can see here, Brazil, China, Russia had huge, you see that 80%, almost 90% inflation. Again, imagine your wages are growing 2.5, 3%, whereas inflation is 80%, 90%. I think currently the conflict in Iran, the Iran inflation rate is over 100%. That has an enormous effect on an economy. when you have inflation that's out of control. Is there any confusion over inflation? If other economic variables like prices, wages, interest rates do not move in sync with inflation, or if they adjust for inflation only after a time lag, then inflation can cause three types of problems. One of the problems is unintended redistributions of purchasing power, because that's going to be eroded if it's not, if your wages are not growing, or interest rates at that are not growing above inflation, blurred price signals, and difficulties in long-term planning. People are hurt by inflation when they're holding cash. They have financial asset investments where the nominal return does not keep up with inflation. And then what I talked about the most, when wages lag behind inflation. They are a retiree receiving a private company defined benefit pension plan. Ordinary people can sometimes benefit from inflation. A borrower paying a fixed interest rate can end up better off because they can repay their loans in dollars that are worth less than originally expected. Again, you look at the minimum wage and inflation. After adjusting for inflation, the federal minimum wage dropped to 30% from 1965 to 2020, even though the nominal figure climbed from 140 to $7.25 per hour. So you can see that the effects of inflation as we look at the minimum wage here. It's still, because we're not either keeping up or outpacing inflation. Even minimum wages, even wages can uh, uh, lose value, and that means it's losing its purchasing power. Blurred price signals. Prices are the messengers in a market economy, conveying information about conditions of demand and supply. Great example is the gas prices at the pump. Everyone is noticing the high gas prices, no doubt about it. Inflation blurs those price messages. Inflation means that we perceive price signals more vaguely, like static on the radio. When the levels and changes of prices become uncertain, businesses and individuals find it harder to react to economic signals. Inflation can make long-term planning difficult. Planning for retirement in unknown future dollar values is a hard thing to do. That's why we have target that the Federal Reserve tries to maintain, and it moves its monetary policy in order to try and keep us there. Not always successful 100% of the time, but they do a good job in maintaining some price stability in our economy because it's so critical to all of us, both individuals and businesses. More time spent by business finding ways of profiting from inflation versus less time spent on productivity, innovation, and the quality of service. Again, over the last several decades in the United States, there have been times when rising inflation rates have been closely followed by lower productivity rates, and lower inflation rates have corresponded to increasing productivity rates, as the graph shows. And that's what you want. You want high productivity, low inflation. That means good wage growth. People are happy, they're buying, they're going on vacation, and that is a good thing. Indexing and its limitations. Indexed, a price, wage, or interest rate is adjusted automatically for inflation. Uh, Social Security has a cost of living adjustment each year. Union contracts have cost of living adjustments, a contractual provision that wage increases will keep up with inflation. On the borrowing side, ARMs or adjustable rate mortgages also adjust for inflation as well. A type of loan a borrower uses to purchase a home in which the interest rate varies with market interest rates. Examples of indexing arrangement in government programs. The U.S. income tax code is designed so income levels where high tax rates kick in are indexed to rise automatically with inflation. The levels of Social Security benefit increases each year along with the CPI. So they do index Social Security with CPI. The U.S. government also offers index bonds, promising to pay a certain real rate of interest above whatever inflation rates occur. So there are bonds that are pegged with inflation so that if inflation rises, the interest rate paid rises as well. And that's it. That's it on inflation. Next up, we'll talk about unemployment in the country. Thank